Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Velasquez. I'm the coordinator of International Intercultural Education at Metropolitan Community College, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our final virtual program of 2020 today. Thank you so much for taking time at this busy time of the year. If you would like to secure a copy of the book and are an MCC student, staff, or faculty member, contact the MCC libraries who will mail you a borrowed copy. They will explain to you the return procedures since their buildings are currently closed. We ask that everyone keep your microphones silenced during this discussion. You will be allowed to send chat messages to the hosts at any time, and we will direct those questions to our presenter, most likely at the end of the presentation. Your continued attendance at International Intercultural Education programming could qualify you for recognition throughout the year. To be considered, you must complete the online evaluation and include your name and contact information. The online address will be in the chat and also on a slide at the end of the program. It is mccneb.edu/IIEEVAL. Pastor Kenneth A. Allen Sr. was born in Little Rock, Arkansas. He graduated with honors from Central High School in Omaha, Nebraska, and continued his education by earning a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the University of Texas at Austin and a Master of Divinity Morehouse School of Religion at the Interdenominational Theological Center, ITC, of Atlanta, Georgia. Upon being licensed and ordained by his father, the late Pastor James Allen, at Vine Memorial Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Reverend Allen began full-time ministry as Director of Christian Education at Pleasant Grove Baptist Church in Detroit, Michigan. Since that time, he has also served in full-time ministry of pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Philadelphia, Minister of Education and Growth, and Senior Pastor of Mount Zion First Baptist Church in San Antonio, Texas, and Christian Education Director at New Hope Church in Wayne, Michigan. In 2008, Zion extended the pastoral call to Reverend Allen to serve as its 12th pastor shepherd. He has instituted numerous ministries and outreach efforts at Zion, resulting in a renewed commitment to discipleship, community empowerment, and education. Reverend Allen has held leadership positions and received numerous recognitions throughout his career, including but not limited to President, Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance of Metropolitan Omaha from 2009 to 2012, Presidential Community Service Award, Breakfast Optimist Club of Omaha, B.J. Nellum Lighthouse Award, Center for Holistic Development of Omaha, Nebraska, African American Leadership Award, Urban League of Nebraska in 2017. We are very honored that Reverend Allen has taken his time from his very busy schedule to lead our discussion of My Vanishing Country today. Please welcome Pastor Kenneth A. Allen Sr.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so glad to be here. I want to begin by saying thank you. Those are the two most powerful words in the universe. And when they are directed appropriately, they can move mountains, whether it's a thank you to God or whether it's a thank you to someone who has extended a generous invitation. And in this case, I want to thank Barbara Velasquez and Dr. Cynthia Gooch Grayson, two of my partners in crime, for allowing me to share with you. It's good to be here in the midst of this season of change, this season of political change, this season of pandemic. There are lots of issues on the table, and there is no better time, I think, for a book like this than during this period of change and transition. And I contend that the changes that have taken place in 2020 will resonate across the next century. We are looking not at just a change for a year or 2 years, but we're looking at change that will set our course, our direction for the next 100 years or more. And so it's good to be here to discuss with you this wonderful book by a brilliant young man. Bakari Sellers is someone I have admired for a few years now. I came to know him, as many of you may have also, on CNN. And he led the discussions and participated in the political commentary in such an authoritative and brilliant way that I wanted to know, who is this? And of course, the first thing that we do these days when we want to know who someone is that we go to the internet. So I went to the internet, and then I went to my go-to website. And my go-to website is Wikipedia. Sometimes the information is not 100% correct, but it's a good starting point. And I read a little bit about him. So when I was contacted to share in this discussion and to discover that he had written a memoir, I was very, very excited. And so I want to just give an overview of some of the portions of the book. Even though it's a relatively short memoir by today's standards, and as compared to President Barack Obama's, still we can't cover everything that is covered in the book in these 250 pages. That would require a much lengthier discussion. But I want to hit some high points or some key thoughts from the book. And I hope that some of you have already read the book, and I hope that all of you will eventually read the book. And that would be a good project to finish before the end of the year. Bakari Sellers, as you can see from the slide before you, is the son of civil rights icon Cleveland Sellers. And Sellers is one of those young persons who were a part of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a group that was powerfully led first by John Lewis and then later by Stokely Carmichael. And Cleveland Sellers did not believe, interestingly enough, did not believe in protest. As a young man, he was teaching and working with students at South Carolina State University in Orangeburg, South Carolina. He had grown up in Denmark, South Carolina, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But as a young man, he was teaching, and there was a protest, and Cleveland Sellers wanted to dissuade people from participating in the protest because he felt that the best way for us to make progress as a race was through teaching and through training and through mentoring, rather than being in the streets. He thought it was important to be in the classroom or in the halls of academia. But he went outside to try to dissuade some folks from participating in a protest, and the police were there. And to make a long story short, the police ended up shooting 7 people, and those persons, many of them died. And when they looked for someone to blame, when they looked for a scapegoat, they identified Cleveland Sellers. In fact, the governor of the state of South Carolina himself labeled Cleveland Sellers as the one who ignited the protests that resulted in the killings. And Bakari Sellers, when he talks about it, talks about that experience that his father had with great emotion, because that set in motion a series of events that ended up causing Cleveland Sellers to be convicted of starting a riot. And then they had several other charges. He went to prison for several years so that his daughter, Bakari Sellers' sister, was born while her father was still in prison. His mother had become pregnant. They were married. She had become pregnant by Cleveland Sellers. And before he went to prison, by the time she had their daughter, and their daughter's name is Nosizwe, Bakari's sister, and Bakari's brother is Lumumba. Both of them names of African with African connections, and so it was that Cleveland Sellers became a symbol of the civil rights movement in South Carolina, and that event became known as the Orangeburg Massacre. Also, Bakari Sellers was the youngest person to serve in the South Carolina legislature when he was elected at the young age of 22. And he was the youngest African-American elected official in the nation at that time. In 2014, he was the Democratic nominee for Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina. And he was, in 2016, invited to be the speaker, or to be one of the speakers at the Democratic National Convention. Since then, he has become, as I mentioned earlier, a CNN political analyst and a practicing attorney who fights to give a voice to the voiceless. So significant have his contributions been that Time magazine named him one of their 40 under 40, and a list that they produce on an annual basis. He was named one of the 40 under 40. And so if we can go to the next slide. These are some areas in which I've chosen to organize our discussion or my presentation, and then we'll have discussion following this overview. I want to talk about the pre-birth. I've already hinted at some of it in the experiences of Cleveland Seller. My contention is that Bakari Sellers, like many of us, had his path set even before he was born. There were choices that were made for him, choices where he did not have any options himself because of the way in which he was born, where he was born, and to whom he was born. And then I want to talk about his early life, according to his memoir, and then talk about the place where he was born, that he refers to as the Black Belt, a section of the country that stretches from South Carolina to Mississippi. Then I would like to talk about the education of Bakari Sellers, not only his formal classroom education, but the experiences that he had in his life that shaped him and molded him and gave him his worldview. And then talk a little bit about his political career. He goes into great depth talking about some of his campaigns and what he experienced in those campaigns, and then talk about his season of political disengagement when he left politics as his primary work. And I contend that it is, you'll notice I use the word season implying that it is not something that will last forever, because I believe that he has more ahead of him in the political arena. And then I hope we can have some discussion and have opportunity for some questions. So I've already mentioned that Bakari Sellers was a young man who was born to a father who was seen as a radical, but his father was born to a family that had a solid foundation. And ultimately, when Cleveland Sellers was released from prison, he took his very young family back to Denmark, South Carolina. Denmark, South Carolina is a city of about 3,400 residents, named after A.B. Denmark. Sellers, Bakari says he wished when he was a child that it had been named after Denmark Vesey, who led a slave revolt and was eventually executed because of his attempts to lead that slave revolt in 1822. But the city of Denmark was not named after Denmark Vesey. It was named after A.B. Vesey, who was an industrialist and a railroad owner and a businessman residing there in the city. And the town took on his name. This black belt that I talked about just a few moments ago was originally called the Black Belt because of the rich black soil in these communities that stretched from South Carolina all the way over to Mississippi, which allowed for good farming and thriving communities. But by the time Bakari Sellers had grown up, it was no longer an area known for its thriving agricultural products. It was known primarily as an area where the majority of the population was African American. And you can see on the map the dots of the various communities that comprised the Black Belt, from the Carolinas all the way over to Mississippi and even over into eastern Arkansas and eastern and northern Louisiana. And Bakari Sellers goes to great lengths to point out the fact that so much had changed in the Black Belt. Jobs had been taken away by legislation like NAFTA that opened the trade borders of the United States, but hurt United States producers, especially of agricultural goods. And then in this Black Belt, Sellers talks about the despair that has set in, the isolation. Most of these communities have no hospital, for example. If they have a grocery store, the residents have to travel miles and miles to get to the one grocery store in the area. And we all know that a monopoly it can be a dangerous thing when you have the only store in the area, in the region. You can sort of treat your customers the way you want to treat them, and without any fear of reprisal. And finally, Bakari Sellers says that the Black Belt is the nation's largest contiguous thread of poverty. And so he introduces us to the Black Belt, and he presents Denmark as a city that is emblematic of and representative of the Black Belt area. A city that was once, a small town that was once thriving, active, bustling with activity and jobs, now just barely able to survive. Denmark, South Carolina, is also notable for the presence of Voorhees College, a tiny, historically Black college. And that gives much of the life to Denmark that it currently has. But even the college has suffered greatly over the last 40 to 50 years, and its enrollment has decreased. because of changes that have taken place in trade, in the areas of trade and business and commerce across the United States. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next. Okay. In his early life, after the family had moved a few times, they settled in Denmark. When Bakari Sellers' grandparents died, the Sellers family, grandfather died, he left the house to his son, Cleveland Sellers. And so for most of his young life before he went off to college, Bakari and his family lived in the large house that had been occupied by his grandparents. And like most kids his age, Bakari rode his bicycle, played with his friends, and Bakari was a brilliant young man. Even at an early age, he showed academic promise, and he was skipped 2 grades so that he graduated from high school when he had just turned 16. But because he was tall for his age, he indicates that by the time he was 14, he was 6'5". Can you imagine being 6'5" at the age of 14? So even though he was in class with the 16-year-olds, he fit in physically because of his height. But socially, he was still a 14-year-old. He was still very young. And he said, looking back on it, he's not sure that it was the best thing that he skipped 2 grades because socially, he didn't develop as quickly as he otherwise would have. But you can't go back and change what has already happened. Bakari in his early life would play with his friends, would hang out with them, and he learned how to jive. And jive, today's young people would call it trolling. But my generation would call it playing the dozens. I was born in 1959. Bakari Sellers was born in 1984. We called it playing the dozens. And basically playing the dozens means that you have an exchange of insults, and each person tries to make their insult funnier, even wittier, and more powerful than the other person's put down or insult. And by the way, when the jiving is over, when the exchange of insults has gone as far as it can go, and sometimes it would last 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, then you didn't fight. You shook hands, as it were. You were still friends. And quite often there would be a crowd that would be gathered around to listen to the exchange of insults, and then to provide sound effects when the insults had been exchanged, to let people know when they had really hit a zinger. And so Bakari Sellers' experience growing up in some ways was typical, and yet in some ways it was very much atypical. Let's go to the next slide. The education of Bakari Sellers. And I shared with you a few moments ago that when I talked about his education, I wanted to talk not only about his formal education, but also the education that was given to him in his home life. For most of us, the first teachers in our lives are our parents. And that was certainly the case with Bakari Sellers. His parents, especially his father, taught him to think for himself, to stand on his own 2 feet. And they taught him that you can do anything, even in America, despite laws of segregation and discrimination that were still around, even in the early 80s when Bakari was born. Um, uh, his parents said, you can do anything and you can be anything you want to be. His sister, Nosizwe, went on to become a medical doctor, and ultimately Bakari went on to become an attorney. But a critical part of his education was what I call the burden of his father. He took on the burden of his father's prison sentence and indictment and blame for being the source of the Orangeburg massacre. His father's fight became his fight. It doesn't always happen that way, but Bakari took that fight on gladly. He felt his father's pain. His father would often take him to community meetings, and Bakari would sit and listen to them strategize and discuss the political events of the day and talk about how they were going to fight racism in their community or how they were going to make the community a better place. And even as a small child, he liked being with his father, and he was his father's twin, some said. And he would sit and he would listen. He was taking all of this in. Some people might have said it was too much for a young child to hear these kinds of discussions. But for Bakari, when he internalized them, he used them as a means of motivating himself to set goals and to make the world a better place. Because of who his father was, Bakari had the chance to interact with some of the great icons of the 1960 civil rights movement, people like Julian Bond. And he called them uncle. They had such close relationships. Julian Bond and Stokely Carmichael and other leaders of the civil rights movement. Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer were people whom he had met and been familiar with at a young age. And so as he prepared to go to college, his parents gave him free rein with one exception. They said, you must go to an HBCU. You must go, and they made that the requirement for all three of the children in their family. They had to go to an HBCU, and so he chose Morehouse College, the college that has a national and international reputation as the only college in America that is an all-male HBCU. He chose Morehouse, and then after graduating from Morehouse, he went to the School of Law at the University of South Carolina. During his time at Morehouse College, he met a lot of talented individuals, and he had a group of friends who became his posse. And they eventually shared dormitory housing. They shared housing together. And they began to plan Bakari's ascent in the political realm. It is so interesting to me that Bakari planned to run for the House of Representatives, the State House of Representatives, against a 20-year incumbent, a white man who had held the position for 20 years. And the strategizing began while he was still an undergraduate at Morehouse College. At Morehouse College, he learned more about public speaking, and he learned two things. He learned that a successful politician is someone who builds relationships. And then he learned the true definition of leadership He said, a leader is not just somebody who has a bunch of people following him. That's not what a leader is. A leader is someone who makes leaders. In other words, the people who associate with him become leaders in their own right, organizing, working with people, making a difference. A leader is someone who has followers who in turn create followers. And what I thought was so fascinating about that was that that is the exact definition of leadership that Jesus gave. Now, you didn't expect me to go through this whole presentation without talking about Jesus just for a moment, did you? Jesus in the Great Commission, 40 days after he had risen from the dead, gathered his disciples, his followers together, and said, go and make disciples of all peoples, all nations. And so Bakari's definition of leadership falls directly in line with Jesus's definition of leadership. And when Bakari graduated from Morehouse, he announced that he was going to run for office. He talked to all the key people in the community. He even met with the person whom he was going to run against. And then he met with Congressman Jim Clyburn, the powerhouse congressman whom we all know had such a pivotal role in getting the nomination for Joe Biden, the Democratic nomination. And then from there, of course, Biden was elected president. And that has been certified with the Electoral College vote this past Monday. So Bakari becomes a politician, and he fights for issues like clean water, good health care, better schools with better resources, more resources. And after serving as a state representative, youngest person in the state of South Carolina to serve in public office, youngest African-American office holder in the United States, Bakari decides to run for lieutenant governor. He runs for lieutenant governor and ran a very vigorous campaign, but he lost to McMaster. McMaster eventually becomes governor of South Carolina. And an interesting side note that Bakari went to Jim Clyburn to talk to him, to let him know that he was going to run for lieutenant governor. And Jim Clyburn said, among the things he said to him, was that if an African-American could win statewide, Jim Clyburn said, don't you think that I would have already done that? And Bakari does not record his answer to that. But I thought that was an interesting statement. Clyburn was saying that you can't win. If you can win, I would have already won statewide as governor or as lieutenant governor or as US senator. Bakari talks about his experiences on the campaign trail, going to small town after small town. For those of you who are not familiar with South Carolina is a state of small towns. There's no city in South Carolina that has an official population of over 350,000. I believe Charleston is the largest city in South Carolina. And so he went to every county in South Carolina campaigning. And he talks about the fish fries and the visits to churches and sharing in their times of fellowship. And what a great experience that was. And in one particular event, he interacted with Clementa Pinckney, the pastor of Mother Emanuel AME Church, the church that years later would become the victim of Dylan Roof, a young white man's diabolical plan to kill African Americans. And he talked extensively about how Clementa Pinckney, who was not only pastor of Mother Emanuel AME Church, but also a great public speaker and a South Carolina state senator. And then during his political career, after he had lost the election, one night he was at a fundraiser for Hillary Clinton in June 2015. After the fundraiser was over, he was on his way home. And suddenly he noticed there in Charleston that police cars were filing by, were driving by with their sirens and their lights flashing. And he knew something terrible had happened. And eventually he discovered that there had been the massacre of the Mother Emanuel 9, a 20-year-old boy, Dylan Roof, white boy, had come into prayer meeting and had been graciously and hospitably welcomed in to the prayer meeting at Mother Emanuel AME Church. And at Mother Emanuel AME Church, they were accustomed to receiving anyone and everyone. The pastor in Bible study made it a point to have this young man sit next to him so that the young man would be comfortable in this environment. And then when they had prayer, closed their eyes, the young man took out his firearm and started shooting, ultimately killing 9 people, including Pastor Pinckney. There was a woman, the last one that was still alive, and Dylan Roof said he was going to allow her to live so that she could tell everybody what happened. And Dylan Roof did not know that Pastor Pinckney's wife and daughter were in another room in the building, waiting on Pastor Pinckney to finish a Bible study and prayer meeting so that they could return home that evening. So his wife and his daughter, Pinckney's wife and daughter, were spared. Needless to say, Bakari Sellers was destroyed. And I say destroyed, he was broken by the events at Mother Emanuel AME Church. And he took on the responsibility of being an interpreter for the events over the next several days as masses, crowds of people gathered around Mother Emanuel AME Church and talk. There began to be talk on the part of the governor and other elected officials to take down the Confederate flag that flew over the state capitol in South Carolina. And one day, as he was sharing analysis about the event, he was invited to become an analyst for CNN. They needed somebody who could speak authoritatively about what happened there in South Carolina. They needed somebody who had boots on the ground. And so Bakari Sellers' career began to change. He was no longer the elected official. Now he had moved into the deep waters of political commentary. And he was so effective in his commentary about the Mother Emanuel 9 that he was invited to take on a permanent role as an analyst for CNN. Um, and I have to touch on this. Bakari Sellers, what I love about this memoir is Bakari Sellers' transparency. And I do hope that you'll read this book. His transparency is refreshing. He's honest about the fact that he suffers from anxiety. And his problems with anxiety began when he was in elementary school, when a friend of his died. And suddenly Bakari became afraid that, began to fear that he could die at any moment. And he became fearful of even going to sleep. There were nights where he didn't go to sleep for weeks. 4, 5, 6 nights in a row where he could not sleep and was fearful. Ultimately, his parents got him some therapy, got him some help. And as Bakari began to look around, he realized that his mother also probably suffered from mental health issues because of her volatility. And his mother finally confronted those issues in her life. And Bakari, as he began to look at his father, realized that his father also suffered from mental health issues, but his father would never admit it. By this time, his father had received a pardon, and because he had received a pardon, he was able to get gainful employment. The family was doing well, living a middle-class life there in Denmark, but he still saw challenges that his father was dealing with in terms of mental illness. And how could one be surprised by that? With all that his father had been through, it's not surprising that he would have mental health issues. But his father never dealt with those issues, never confronted them in the way that Bakari did, or even Bakari's mother did. But interestingly, Bakari took his anxiety issues and his anger and used them as fuel to help him to confront the giant problems of his day and of this day. What is fascinating to me, and I think part of this comes from his Morehouse experience, is that Bakari is saying, you may not have a problem-free life. Almost nobody does. But your problems can become the impetus for your power. You can use your problems to fuel your struggles and your fights against the powers that be. And so he takes his anxiety and turns it into a blessing. Finally, 2 things. Bakari says that he almost entitled this book, Anger is Not a Sin, because he felt that the family members, some of the family members of the Mother Emanuel 9, moved to forgiveness too quickly. They didn't take time to process their anger. And that was the majority. Not all of the family members forgave. Some of them still have not forgiven. But Bakari says that's okay, because you can use your anger to fuel your work. And again, I mentioned Jesus Christ because it is so in line with what Bakari talks about. The Bible says, be angry and sin not. Jesus was angry, and it's okay to be angry. It's what you do with your anger that makes the difference. Finally, in this season of political disengagement, Bakari has stepped away from direct involvement in politics, in that he is not holding office or running for office. He engages in a wonderful discussion about the strength of Black women and how so many of them suffer from mistreatment in our society, and how Black women, even though they own Black businesses and are some of the most effective Black business owners, their businesses quite often don't receive the attention that people of other races receive, business owners of other races receive. And Black women tend to die in childbirth, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of their education and their income. They tend to die in childbirth at a much higher and more alarming rate than women of any other ethnic group. And he shares the tender story of how his wife gave birth to their twins. Their twins, Stokely, named after Stokely Carmichael, and their daughter. And these children were born. The children were healthy. At least it appeared that way at the beginning. But his wife became very ill, and she almost died in childbirth, even though they had taken every precaution. And he talks about the fact that the people who saved his wife were women, female doctors, a team of female doctors that he and his wife had secured to provide care for her during the prenatal period and the birth of their twins. And Sadie and Stokely were fine, but they began to notice there were some problems with little Sadie. Ultimately, she had to have a liver transplant. They waited 93 days for a liver that she could receive. She ultimately received the liver transplant, and now she is doing well. These are some of the highlights from this book, and I would close by pointing out that Bakari Sellers is not done yet. If my math is correct, he's only 36 years old, still a young man. And I contend that we will be hearing from him. And in fact, in an interview, I watched an interview that he did with the television show Frontline. In that interview, he said that he would be running for Congress. He lives in Jim Clyburn's district. He said that he would be running for Congress in 2022. And so we have not heard the last of Bakari Sellers on the political stage. And he's following the blueprint of Barack Obama. Barack Obama wrote his memoir, and then he used that as a launching pad for his national political career. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Reverend Allen, for giving us a marvelous review of the book, My Vanishing Country, and history of Sellers family, etc. We have Jason who's opening your microphones for those who would like to speak.
I would.
Hello, Dr. Cynthia Gooch Grayson.
Hey, Pastor Allen, how are you? Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, surely. Oh,
I
thank
really
you.
appreciate your investment of time and eagerness in wanting to lead this discussion, particularly at a time that has not been very easy for you. I would, if I may, like to share with the virtual audience that after Reverend Allen accepted the task of leading this discussion, prior to today, after he accepted, he lost his father, Reverend James Sterling Allen. And so Reverend Allen still wanted to do this, and we're grateful that you did. It was wonderful. And as you were talking, I'll be, I'm doing what I always ask people not to do. I didn't finish the book.
Okay.
But when you were talking about how his life was kind of set up for him, I was thinking about you and your father. And then I did some introspection as well. But I did look up the meaning of his name, and it is Swahili, and it means noble promise. And so I thought that was very interesting, and what a gift he is to our country. So that leads me to my question. Why did you said what he was going to title the book, but why did he title it My Vanishing Country? Did he explain that?
Did not in the book, but in the interview that I saw in doing my research.
Uh-huh.
He said he wanted to name um, uh, that anger is not a sin, but the publisher did not want him to.
Okay.
And it was basically as simple as that. And he didn't explain why the publisher did not want him to. I suspect that they were concerned that it might be viewed as having maybe a harsh tone, and that would dissuade people from reading the book or purchasing it. I suspect, but he does not say. But he said he names a chapter in one of the chapters. Anger is not a sin. In fact, it's in chapter 9 on page 182. Anger is not a sin. So he still got it in there. Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Sure.
I would like to remind our audiences that Metro's library staff have been very generous to find ways to get the book to you. So if you haven't read it yet and you are a Metro student or Metro staff or faculty, contact the Metro libraries and they will mail a book to you and let you know how you should go about returning them. And I'll also say it's one of the books that we've offered that's quite easy to get through. It's not long,
Right.
Reverend.
Right, it's not. And it's and it reads so well because Bakari, and I wish I could have communicated that more effectively. He writes in such a way that you feel as if you're there in the room at the place, particularly when he writes about the birth of his children and the near death of his wife. It's a very, very moving, powerful passage. And as someone who attended school in the Atlanta University Center, I thought his description of his time at Morehouse College, the politics of being student body president, that was fascinating because I see those places that he was talking about, and been in that milieu at Morehouse, having gone to Morehouse School of Religion in the Atlanta University Center. So that was also for me a very vivid depiction of his experiences.
I have a couple of comments and then a question. I'm Liz Rhodes, and I'm one of the adult ed instructors. Thank you, Reverend Allen. It was so good to listen to you talk about the book. You not only highlighted the narrative so well, but you captured the essence of the book. I was able to read it because I read my first time ever a book on my smartphone. I was able to get
Okay. Oh,
I might have impressed my kids. I don't know. But anyway, and I enjoyed it on my phone. I got it from the library's Overdrive. So you can get the app and then get it that way. But I enjoyed every point that you made, Reverend. And I have a question about a specific point of the book, but hopefully the general bigger implication. When he talked about the part where he's talking to Clyburn, and Clyburn responds, "Don't you think I would have already done that?" And it had to have been intentional on Bakari Seller's part not to explain, "Well, I don't care what you think," as he walked out the door, because his actions proved otherwise. My question for you, Reverend, is how would you fill in those blanks that the reader are left with? And then what is the bigger general implication for us as your congregation, so to speak? If you could take the pulpit here for a minute.
Said one of my parishioners. Thank you for that question, because that was fascinating to me. I have, I've been an admirer of Jim Clyburn's for a number of years. And it was so relevant, that discussion was so relevant, because as many of us know, Jamie Harrison just finished running for the United States Senate, for the US Senate against Lindsey Graham. And many of us thought that he had an excellent chance of winning and that he was going to win. But as I began to look, as I put my idealistic hat aside and looked at it with eyes of realism a few days before the election, I said, if Jamie Harrison were elected, it would be both of the US senators from South Carolina would be African American. No one has ever won statewide, no African American has ever won statewide office in South Carolina. The odds, even though he had $100 million at his disposal, the odds were against Jamie Harrison. So that by the time I read the book and read this exchange, I was exactly where Clyburn was. That if it had been possible, he would have already done it. Now the question becomes, or the issue becomes, when does it happen? Do we always say, well, Clyburn couldn't do it, so nobody can do it? No, somebody still has to break that glass ceiling. Somebody has to still tear down those barriers. I believe that Bakari Sellers, although he does not say what his response was, I believe he left that meeting with the determination that if nobody else did, that he was going to make history against all odds. And so I think he still has that burning desire within himself. That's what I talk about, a season of political disengagement. We have not heard the last. And if he runs for Congress and if he wins, it will be the last office he holds, because he has that determination. And by the way, because of my involvement with politics, I was a delegate to the Democratic National Convention in 2016 for Hillary Clinton. My father was very involved politically, and I went to some of those meetings with him as a child that Bakari Sellers talked about. But as I read between the lines and as I do some parsing, I'm not sure that Bakari Sellers and Jim Clyburn are best friends, which is why Bakari Sellers could say, I'm going to run in 2020. I think I mentioned it to my wife. My wife said, well, I guess Jim Clyburn is going to step down. He's going to retire. And I said, not necessarily. There may be a titanic struggle. Just as when Cory Booker ran for mayor of Newark, New Jersey, against an institution, Mayor Sharp, lost the first time, won the second time. Both battles were bitter. I think we may see a changing of the guard in South Carolina, or at least an attempt at that. That may be a long question. I mean, that's a long answer to a short question, but I hope that responded was there. Did that answer your question?
Yes, and it's good to hear your insights on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like again to thank Reverend Allen for everything he has invested in the presentation today. It's just been a lovely engagement. We want to thank the audience members. We know this is a busy time for you. Reverend Allen, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we shut things down as we've reached 1 o'clock?
I would close the way I opened by saying thank you. Thank you for allowing me to share this discussion and pushing me or encouraging me to read this wonderful book. I have stars, highlights, check marks, asterisks all over the place in this book. And so I'll be referring to it often. Thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you're doing. I look forward to sitting in on future sessions of Diversity Matters and other forums that Metro Community College sponsors. You guys do a great work. Thank you.
Thank you again. Jason, would you put up our final slides? So as you saw in the chat, we have an online evaluation at mccneb.edu/IIEEVAL. This is how you will be considered for recognition for your continued attendance by completing that and adding your name. And then our next official book discussion is in January 26th from 10 to 11 a.m. The book is There by Tommy Orange. Discussion will be led by Gretchen Carroll, who's Cheyenne Arapaho of Oklahoma. She is the Multicultural Outreach Coordinator at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. We encourage you to join us for that. But I would also like to say one of our previous books, White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism, was so popular that we promised to do a repeat session, which will happen before they're there. It is planned for Thursday, January 7th, beginning also at 12 noon. And our discussion leader is Dr. Eden Wales Friedman from Minnesota, who will be back with us. And if you've already participated, you don't need to come back because it is the same discussion, but we are not going to require you to prove that. If you need to a little bit more on white fragility, you are welcome back on January 7th. No need to register for that. And you can contact me for further information. And also, because we are at the end of 2020, we want to remind you of one of the longest standing programs at Metropolitan Community College. We will be hosting the 36th annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. celebration. It will be held on Thursday, January 14th. Again, start time 12 noon. This year it will be virtual, as are all of our other programs until we get into our new normal. And just contact our offices, watch the Omaha Star, look at the Metro website for more details, free and open to the public. and you'll just be connecting by a virtual link also. And our mistress of ceremonies is Terry Sanders, publisher with the Omaha Star. And our keynote speaker is Dr. Maurice Hobson from Georgia State University. And we'll have lovely music by Jason Wagner II and Chad Stoner and his group of musicians. So we look forward to having a robust crowd. There's many, many activities coming forward. Never hesitate to communicate with us. For more information, the general website is mccneb.edu/intercultural. That can get you to all of our programming. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the work that everybody's doing. Jason is behind the scenes and provides stellar technical work. It is the end of our 2020 season. We're looking forward to seeing everyone in 2021. And please be safe. Please be smart. COVID is not over, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes.
And
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.